There's no reason to give up because it's culture.
Because like I said, being trans on social media and being trans in real life are like completely two different things.
Gay people online love to argue, and some of us really just need to go outside.
My name is Emilio Brown, and I am a senior philosophy major at the University of Memphis. Though I will be receiving my degree in philosophy, over the last few years of my college career, I have been focusing my education more specifically on race and gender theory and how they intersect with one another. For one of my final projects of my senior year, I wanted to create a documentary exploring the lives of non-binary people of color and the ways in which social interactions affect the way they view gender. And you may find yourself asking, what is non-binary?
A non-binary gender is essentially a gender that is not strictly woman or man.
I decided to interview a couple of people in my circle to gain an insight on how they move about the world in regards to their gender expression. Through this process, I have accumulated a range of experiences that I wish to share with others with the intentions of educating and sharing stories. I decided to separate the documentary into 3 different categories. Identity. This is where I ask questions revolving around the non-binary identity and the ways it impacts everyday life. Social media. This section revolves around the interactions on the internet and the ways in which it influences gender expression. And race. This section discusses the intersectionality of race and gender expression. When it comes to being introduced to different gender identities, almost all of the people I interviewed learned of the non-binary identity through an app called Tumblr. Along with learning of new identities, you also learn of the categories and subcategories that these identities are a part of. And for the non-binary identity, this includes the transgender umbrella. Some of the trans community recognize non-binary as a part of the transgender identity, whereas others believe it is completely separate.
I feel like it all comes down to personal preference and trying not to get too caught up in labels, but just thinking about what they mean to you. Me personally, I do identify as a trans. I do see non-binary as a trans identity. I do consider myself a trans person because my identity deviates from societal norms, and I avidly reject the gender that has been placed on me in favor of presenting as I please in a way that feels authentic to me.
I do, but at the same time, I do get kind of nervous that like I'm not considered, I guess. Sometimes I feel like I'm not like androgynous enough to appear trans, if that makes sense. But I consider myself to be.
I am trans mask because I did take T, but like I don't really consider that a reason of why. I just kind of had voice dysphoria, so I wanted to deal with that. But I don't really consider that why I'm like one thing versus the other, but I still consider myself kind of like under the trans umbrella.
While some I interviewed found themselves under this umbrella, there was one person who felt differently.
I understand why a lot of non-binary people do, but I feel as though because of the way that I present myself, because of the way that I can pass very easily as like a cis straight man. So I feel as though I'm not really a part of the trans community just because I still retain a lot of the cis het kind of identity from before. Like I still move in like the same way. So I don't think, I don't really consider myself part of the trans community.
This goes to show that sometimes this question of whether or not you feel like you fit under an umbrella of some sorts can be up to personal preference. Along with personal preference, I wanted to know the ways in which gender identity sometimes affected the relationships we have with those around us.
It's like my day-to-day is affected by it. I'm gonna surround myself with people that go through the same things.
With my guardians, like they're really accepting of me. I don't think they really understand it, but they are very accepting. So they don't really mind like calling me Brendon and stuff like that. Like they don't really care. But like all my friends are really supportive and my partner is really supportive as well.
I'm really only out as like non-binary to, well, I don't even really want to say like out because like at this point, I don't think that like coming out matters for me, because it's just like, no, they're not gonna, they like, even if I told everybody, they would still perceive me as like a man, which is kind of like whatever to me at this point. They are never going to see me as like non-binary. Like maybe my sister, I haven't told my sister really about it, but I do have multiple cousins that I have told, like, these are my pronouns, I'm non-binary, this is how this is. And they're just like, yeah, that's chill. But then at the same time, those are my cousins that are also gay. So it's kind of like,
Yeah.
they're just like, oh yeah, that's chill, like this, whatever, like cool. We're like we're all with that. So like that part is cool. In the romantic sense though, that has been difficult to deal with. Just being a queer person in general, like a queer masked person trying to date women, that was very hard for them to, one, perceive me in like a positive light and consider me like a valid option, and then just like to be okay with like my identity. But my current girlfriend is like very cool with it, though she doesn't like fully, I don't think she like fully gets it, but she does support me, which I really appreciate. So that's kind of how that works.
When it comes to how their identity affects the way they interact with others, Aries spoke about how their identity as a Black woman affects them just as much as their identity as a non-binary person.
I identify as a non-binary Black woman because I cannot separate the two. I do not have the privilege of being able to separate the two. The way I navigate this world will always be filtered through my experience as a Black woman. So specifically when I navigate white spaces and I navigate cis spaces, even though I'm non-binary, the fact that I am a Black woman will always trump that. And so I do find myself being a little hyper aware of how their perception of me as a Black woman may influence our interactions, but I try my best to not let it change the way that I react in the world.
The experience that Aries is describing is one that anthropologist W.E.B. Du Bois created a name for back in 1903, double consciousness. Double consciousness describes the challenge Black people have trying to navigate their lives through the eyes of their oppressors while also being hyper-aware of their Black identity. Though this term was originally used to describe the Black experience, in recent years it has been adopted to explain the way different identities conflict with one another.
It's not necessarily that I identify more than the other, but they intersect in a way that is impossible to separate. As I said before, I do not have the privilege of having my gender identity absolve the racial one in the way that we see a lot with white non-binary people. A lot of white non-binary people, a lot of white queer people use their identities to distance themselves from whiteness. I do not have that luxury of being able to use my identity to distance myself from the issues, from the marginalization of my race, unfortunately. So when I say that it influences the way that I navigate spaces in the way that it influences other people's perception of me, I'm not mentioning it as something that's added on, but just something that already exists in the way that Black people have to navigate spaces. It's nothing that's necessarily being put on top of it, like, oh, they are consciously seeing me as a Black woman, so they're treating me different. It's just the unconscious biases that non-Black people already have that add to the way that I move through the world, or my perception of the world.
I think like growing up socialized as a Black woman and then identifying as non-binary is just a whole another experience, because I definitely still feel connected to Black womanhood because it's like such a distinct experience. And I know that a lot of people in the world still view me as a Black woman, so they still treat me as a Black woman. And that's, I don't know, it's different than, I guess, ideally being treated as no gender, or if I was, viewed as a male, or even if I was viewed as a white woman. So I think I still identify with that a lot, even though I'm non-binary, if that makes sense.
Though it was defined back in the early 1900s, W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness can be used to describe the dynamics between race and gender for Black people in today's society. Along with race, I wanted to know how certain mental or physical disabilities affected the way people understood gender.
So I have two. I don't know if I listed both, but I have sciatica. Sciatica is like accompanied by like a sharp shooting up your left leg. I feel like generally like having a physical disability, for some people it does and for some people it doesn't, but for me, like, it does kind of impact how I feel about myself in terms of like even my like core identity as like a trans person. I also have autism, and I think that getting older, like autism has definitely, like realizing I had autism when I was like 16 or so kind of helped me like understand that it wasn't really just me imagining things. Not only that, but it helped explain a lot too, like why I did embrace gender the way I did. I don't really care about what other people think about me in terms of like my appearance. Like, I think I don't really care what people think about me. And I think my autism is part of that. Like, I'm so used to people kind of like thinking weirdly of my mannerisms that like, I don't really care how people perceive my gender as much. And so I'm willing to like put it on display. My autism is part of who I am. I don't understand some things other people do, so I end up tiptoeing around gender a lot. So that's why I'm not really I just identify as non-binary.
We can look at Brendon's experiences with disabilities as a way to understand how different aspects of our lives affect the way we view gender. Including everyone's input on identity, we can infer just how personal gender expression is and how much it varies from person to person. With that being said, for the last question of this section I asked, what does your gender expression look like?
I don't really know how to answer the question because I feel like I don't really have to present my gender. I feel like I am my gender. The way that I perceive the world is kind of how I like go through my gender, and then like the way that I talk, I guess, all of my experiences and stuff. Yeah.
I don't know. I think it really does change by the day or multiple times a day, I guess. There are days when like more physical things like just makeup or outfits make me feel more gender euphoric, and that changes by the day. But a lot of times it's just like the way that I view gender is more like being comfortable with myself, especially since I identify more with like the absence of gender than like being like, I don't know, an amalgamation of genders, which I feel like non-binary people are viewed as sometimes. I don't know. So I feel like my gender expression is just kind of my authentic self.
For me, the way I express myself in my identity is very much like, I like to dress a certain way. I don't really know how, but I really like to tuck in my shirts. I like to fold my I like to fold my pants. I like to cuff them. I really like wearing Vans and like Converse. So I do it a lot through clothes.
Ideally, like the goal eventually isn't really to be like androgynous. It's almost like sounds like kind of stupid, but more so in a like non-human way, like kind of like the fuck is that?
Yeah.
Like, eventually like I want my ears pointed and like just like shit like that. I used to want my belly button removed, which I think is a good example. Just like very like the hell.
When I see myself as like a sexy alien babe or like a sexy robot babe. Like I always say that I'm a woman in the way like a robot is a woman, and they dress her up and they give her like a fat rack. Like that's my gender presentation, or the concept in general. But with the way I like to present myself to the world, I don't know. Yeah, it's just mostly the robot thing. It's just mostly the robot thing. You can dress me up in whatever you want, but in the words of like Janet from The Good Place, I'm not a girl.
Moving on to social media, I wanted to know how this current age of social media influences the non-binary community, more specifically, if it shapes the way people understand identity.
I would say very heavily, because that's kind of how I interact with other queer people in general. And it's also how I express myself most freely, I think. Like if I say something, if I say something about my experience, somebody else can also relate to it, which, you can't always do like in person because there's not a whole lot of people. Like I can't talk about my experience as like a non-binary person at work, because almost everybody there is like straight or like cis. I find that social media is the easiest way for me to express myself.
Social media definitely played a part in my queer awakening. I had a friend of mine ask me, how did you find yourself in such a small town? I grew up in like Indian Head, Maryland, at the bottom of 210 by a fucking naval base. Like, how did you find yourself? And Tumblr opened my world in some negative ways, in some positive ways. But I learned more about queerness besides my feelings or my internal understanding of what it was, because I've had many queer experiences from a young age. But I learned more about the culture, the identities initially through Tumblr, and I was able to find community through the connections that I made there in validation, more importantly. And Twitter was the same. TikTok is the same. It just provides community, camaraderie, fellowship, affirming support, validation in a way that is not always accessible in the physical space.
A large part of the reason why I mostly am just like, yeah, I'm trans, is because growing up, it was so like, especially with Tumblr, there's so many like labels. And I feel like there was a pressure to almost like collect them or like fall into like the most niche specific like label possible. And I hate that shit. That's like too much pressure and it's just too much to think about. So I feel like kind of like that, like growing up, it definitely did. But then eventually I reached a point where I was just like being trans on social media and being trans in real life are different things and they look different.
I feel like during the periods of time where like I didn't have a bunch of other gender nonconforming and trans people in my life, it definitely helped normalize like the idea of myself and like that I could like express myself however I wanted and be whatever kind of person that I wanted to be and still like fit under that trans umbrella without having to be like, I don't know, like the Degrassi trope of trans that I saw when I was like 12,
Along with the way social media influences the non-binary community, I wanted to know if the community was being represented well in online spaces.
Just like every other piece of media, it is predominantly white, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily deliberate. I don't think it's a conscious effort of boosting white creators, but it's just a product of the LGBT movement being co-opted by white people. I definitely believe that people of color will always be the heart of the movement, and they will always be the minds that change, they bring about real physical change in the movement.
For the last and final section of this documentary, I want to explore whether or not different races are accepting of different gender identities and how that impacts individuals.
Among like Latino people, like non-binary people might as well not exist. like in like my culture, it's typically like you get like to become the black sheep of the family. There's a different word for it. It's kind of on the tip of my tongue, but you become kind of like a black sheep of the family, and everybody starts calling you a witch and stuff. Like when you typically step into like, you know, appearing a little bit different, whether that be on the basis of gender or not. I've noticed that like even just having my hair like this color, like when I go to like parts of town that I'm familiar with, like I feel like people look at me a lot just because of my hair. So I can't imagine if it's really connected to my gender. I don't know. You know, the people who are like also like sympathetic, who like are, but the people who aren't like really are, I feel like.
And because I know like Latinos are like typically very religious or very conservative or a mix of the both, they are not very welcoming of anything queer at all. So like non-binary, they're just like, what do you mean? Because a lot of Latino culture in general is very gendered, and to be neither puts you in a space where you're just if you don't fit in either of the categories, people are just going to be angry about that.
To no fault of their own, queerness was beaten out of Black people. It was outlawed from Black people. Queerness made our people hypersexualized and I guess like diminished their personhood in the eyes of white colonizers. Now I say fault, it is not their fault, but it is our responsibility to unlearn that, especially in the popularity of the Black Lives Matter movement and the prevalence of the Black Lives Matter movement, because you cannot say that all Black Lives Matter if all Black lives don't matter to you and you are not including queer Black people. So I definitely think that's one thing that the Black community would need to, an issue that the Black community would really need to hone in on. A lot of our queer brothers and sisters, our trans brothers and sisters, our gay brothers and sisters, our lesbian brothers and sisters are being murdered in cold blood for our identities. And you can't just look past that. You can't ignore that. You can't keep trying to beat the gay away. You can't keep trying to pray the gay away. You can't keep trying to kick your children out in hopes that they will not be anything other than they are, because it's just adding to the woes that we already face, and we don't need to be turning on each other. We need to be supporting each other.
Before I ended each interview, I asked everyone a closing question. What does being non-binary mean to you?
For me personally, a large part of it is my dysphoria, which is kind of depressing.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's like a necessary thing or anything. And I don't think that that's what it means in general. But like for me personally, when I think of like my identity, I mostly think of my dysphoria and also like my expression, I guess. But I couldn't really describe either of those very well. It's very complicated.
To me, I guess it's like about seeing the world with lenses that are kind of your own. Because like if I had to say like, how do I think gender happens? I think it's just because of like all the experiences you have. So I think that being non-binary to me means just like, it's me and my experiences, and no one can experience the world the same way I do as a non-binary person.
I think it means to me freeing myself from the constraints of gender that I've never connected with anyway, and allowing myself to just live in the absence of it. And that just makes me more comfortable.
It kind of means just not subscribing to the perceptions of masculinity and femininity of society. Just kind of being like, I'm just gonna do it my own way. I'm just gonna do it how I feel comfortable. It's the kind of freedom that like Americans like to say that they have, like the way that like Americans are like conservative Americans are like, I have freedom, like America freedom. That is how I feel about being non-binary. It's just like, you just do whatever you want. Like being non-binary to me is just doing what makes me feel good and what makes me feel valid, I think. Whether or not that's what society thinks is valid.
Being non-binary to me just means being myself. Means unpacking or doing away, unlearning everything that I was told that I should be. And tuning into myself and listening to who I am. And every day, I try my best to be who I am.
I hope through this documentary you've learned a little bit more about the non-binary identity and the ways in which different social interactions impact gender expression. Not every identity is the same, and everyone's experience is unique. I want to give a special thanks to Aries, Brendon, Kaip, Emilio, and Maya for sharing your experiences with me and allowing me to share them with others. Thank you for watching.